It's Friday, August 18th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today at the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. with Karen Paul. Karen joined the Senate Historical Office in 1982 to assist in the transfer of Senate records to the National Archives. 2 years later, she was named the first, and so far only, Senate Archivist, a position she holds with distinction today. Karen was a founding member of two of the most influential organizations in the field of congressional and political archives, the Congressional Papers Roundtable of the Society of American Archivists, as well as the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. She is the author of The Documentation of Congress, a report of the Congressional Archivists Roundtable Task Force on Congressional Documentation, and the Records Management Handbook for the United States Senators and their archival repositories. Karen also co-edited, along with Glenn Gray and Rebecca Johnson-Melvin, the American Political Archives Reader, for which she penned the introduction and contributed 3 chapters. Karen, it's great to see you again. It feels like I was just here. We were just together at the CHARM meeting. But thank you for taking some time out of your morning during this recess period, which is always a busy time for the archivist.
Boy, you got it.
When the senators are out of town, that's when the real work gets started. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering, let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your childhood and upbringing. You grew up in Rhode Island.
I did. Grew up on a dairy farm, as a matter of fact. And it was one of the, I think, 300 dairy farms still extant in the state, because the dairy business was...
it's not that big of a state.
No, was moving toward, big agribusiness. Yep. So family farms were forever diminishing in the state. But growing up on a farm, looking back at that, it was such an idyllic existence. Mm-hmm. I have a sister, and we had horses, and were involved with, riding clubs, and had such a really, I think, free existence, which I think a lot of people today probably don't experience.
Sure.
As soon as the weekend came, we would jump on the horses and ride off to hither and yon with backpacks and spend the night. So it was quite a idyllic childhood.
So this is a family farm, so I assume it's all hands on deck, mom and dad and all the kids, and everybody pitches in?
Well, I'm afraid Dad had only daughters, and the daughters were more interested in sailing and horseback riding than the cows.
Not. I can't imagine why.
So that was really fun, because we had neighbors who had 2 sons and a sailboat. So my sister and I would kind of be switched from one family to another for the summer, and so my sister and I were either sailing, as I say, or showing horses in shows and that sort of thing. So my father had the 2 boys, borrowed boys for the summer, who did a lot of the hands-on work of hay, getting hay and apples and all sorts of things.
So it sounds like you had a very active childhood. At what point did your interest in history develop?
Well, growing up in Rhode Island, I think a lot of people, it's really natural. There are a lot of quaint towns, and my grandparents were always really interested in old buildings, and my dad was too. So, I mean, it's kind of a really normal thing, I think, in New England to be interested in history, not necessarily professionally.
Sure.
But as it turned out, I did a lot better in history in school than math and science. So, I mean, I think that sort of reinforced just growing up in the environment of a small village, So my sister and I both, she delves in antiques, and I'm really involved with historic preservation as a hobby or an avocation, actually, even today.
I don't know how you have any spare time doing, you still work full time here at the Senate, but is that something that when did you know that you wanted to pursue that as a course of study, I guess?
Oh, well, I guess in college, again, I majored in really European history.
Was that in University of Rhode Island? Or?
No, I went to Wheaton College in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not Wheaton College, Illinois.
No. Yeah. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, and largely I chose there because of its proximity to Williamsburg. I was just really interested in English and early French history, and also early American history. So, yeah, I went to UVA and did a master's degree, and started to do, when I was there, did some student work in the manuscripts department. And really that's how I backed into archival work.
Tale as old as time.
Oh,
History
yeah.
grad student works in the library.
Yeah. And when I was there as a grad student, a position opened, and so I actually was hired full-time as the first university archivist at the University of Virginia.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I was there for 4 years. Meanwhile, had met Michael, who went to law school anyway, so I ended up spending about 8 years in Charlottesville.
Okay. There are worse places to spend 8 years than Charlottesville.
It was very nice.
So how did you get from actually, let me back up. What was the topic of your master's thesis, and who did you study with?
I studied with Bill Abbott, who was, I think he's passed now, but he was, the colonial American person there. Yeah.
Very, very strong program at UVA, colonial American.
And my thesis topic was childhood in colonial Virginia. So, and I did, oh boy, this is a long time ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had been inspired by a book I'd read as an undergraduate by Philip Arias, Centuries of Childhood, and it was based more on he used traditional sources, letters and journals and diaries and so on, but also did a lot of numbers crunching. In other words, studying population trends, and so that kind of what I did.
Very
in my
much the style
thesis.
of the time, the sort of plyometric, econometric studies in history.
But I really knew I didn't want to teach, and so the archiving opened up a new avenue, and I had won a Colonial Dames scholarship, and went to the National Archives Institute, which I don't think they do that anymore, but it was a two-week course, and after I had that, I knew that's really what I wanted.
That's where
to
you really caught the bug.
Yeah. Yes.
So how did you make the trip from Charlottesville to Washington? Was that Michael, or was that you, or was that let's both get to Washington?
Yeah, it was joint. Michael got a clerkship with the Fourth Circuit judge and in Alexandria, and so we moved to Alexandria, and of course I went to work for the National Archives. Originally, yeah.
So how did you what was the application process like? Did you just walk in and say, I was university archivist at UVA, and they said, right this way, Miss Paul?
Well, no, I mean, it was, someone gave me some really good advice, and it was contact as many people as you can, and spread your resume around. And I remember it was something about 120 resumes I sent to a lot of people in the archives, and other places in Washington that were hiring and looking to hire archivists. So I did get 2 or 3 offers, and I took the one at the archives because, of course, you knew that that particular one came with a 2-year honors training program.
Okay.
And so what that involved was every 3 months, one would rotate to a different branch or department of the archives, so that one's training was, of course, on the job, but really intensive in all aspects.
It's almost like a medical doctor doing rotations through
of archives management. Everything from the conservation lab to the office that did records management and policy, a policy office. So it was, I think, looking back, that 2 years of intensive training really sets a person up.
Right.
And again, they don't really have that anymore, I think. It's
that's too bad.
Well, largely what's replaced it is graduate schools are now offering degrees in archives, and at the time I was there, that wasn't really an option. I mean, it wasn't. The University of Maryland program, Catholic University programs really didn't exist. There were, of course, library schools, but the archival component wasn't developed as it is today, really.
This sounds like the archival equivalent of what Dick Baker was telling me yesterday about when he went to Columbia. He came down to the Library of Congress and did something very similar to I guess, in the library's hope of building up middle management, future managers.
Yes.
Sounds something very similar to that.
Yes.
So you wound up finally after, I guess at the end of those 2 years, you ended up in legislative archives, or it was called back then natural resources.
It was legislative and natural resources.
Because those are just two perfect things to put together.
I know. Guess. Congressional was a different animal at that time. I mean, it was kind of, I'm sure Dick mentioned this, it was really viewed as the kind of an unwanted stepchild within the archives, within family, because, and I'm sure he mentioned, the Senate and House were difficult to deal with, right? They were very demanding, but not very organized at that time.
That's very diplomatic.
Yeah.
That's very diplomatic.
And
so what was it like wrapping your head around it, or what was it like walking into legislative natural resources, and what was the job that you did?
Well, it wasn't legislative. I was in natural resources.
Of course.
It was the business then was really the Bureau of Indian Affairs was heavily used. Those records were in big demand.
Sure, especially the late 70s,
tribes,
early.
Trying to get recognized, and so I was there was at the archives for almost 3 years when the Reagan Revolution happened. And as it turned out, within the archives, there was a reduction in force throughout the government. And so at the archives, it turned out that everyone 3 years and under of service was going to be reduced in force. And so I, of course, was very concerned. And I went through the process and got reduced to a GS2 or 3 in the public building service. That's where I was going to end up. From a 7 to a 2 or 3. No. And so concurrently, the majority flipped in Congress, and so within the Senate, they realized, as Dick and Don used to say, people were tossing records out the windows because they were afraid that
which is only a
the
mild
new majority was going to get into all of their records, right? So Dick and Don were really responsible for talking the secretary into getting someone loaned from the National Archives.
Okay.
And the way that worked was every department had to nominate one contestant for this position. Okay. And because I was going to be out, they put my name up, and I'm sure it was just for that reason, basically. But luck was on my side because I think it was the acting archivist or deputy archivist had set up meetings in each department to interview each of the candidates, and I wasn't really aware of all of this. Communication wasn't very good, but I do remember the day I was in the stacks pulling some dusty volumes, and he walked in and interviewed me on the spot. And but I guess I'd answered all of his questions really well. And at the end of that, he said, well, this is it. He said, I'm selecting you. You're the first one I've interviewed. I don't have time to interview anyone else.
Oh, my goodness.
So that's kind of how it happened.
Serendipity plays a large role in our daily lives, it seems, anyway. So that was incredibly fortunate timing. And so tell me, how much did you know about the Congress, the U.S. Senate?
Not a whole lot, but because of the 2 years of training and that, and having worked in the records management part of the archives, I certainly was on top of scheduling records and how to analyze and survey records and all of that. I'd had all of that training. So essentially that's really what was needed in the Senate, is someone to come in and start from ground up and develop schedules. I worked intensively with the Commerce Committee for the first 3 months, and during that project learned a lot about committee records and so on.
Right.
Now, the senators' records, I had worked a lot at UVA with congressional collections there. So, and I really do think that's why during that initial interview I was chosen, because I had both the government records part of it and the private papers part. I mean, I'd had 4 years of experience in one and 3 in another. So really, I think they had found a good candidate.
Right.
I
agree
people.
For what it's worth. So tell me, Dick and Don had been here. Dick since 75, Don since 76. Were they doing any of this work that you were charged with doing?
Well, I think
or
Don
were you breaking new ground?
Yeah, I think Don was trying to. He was working on some of the access aspects of it. But they, clearly, and Dick especially, I think, clearly understood that it, I remember I should have tried to find it, but he, when we first met, he handed me a kind of a job description. I looked at it and I was thinking, okay, I've got a year to do this. It was like process a lot of records that were on their way to the archives, develop guidelines for senators and for committees, and Another big part of it was the record center system.
Right.
Committees had been sending things there instead of the archives, so there was a huge pile of hundreds of feet of committee records that were in the wrong institution, and so that was a huge thing to sort through. And then there was the matter of the classified records here that were being accumulated and not really, taken care of. So, it was. So that first year, I, really did what I could, and then at the end of that, and did reports for Dick, and they said, well, it looks like we need you a second year. So, but at the end of the second year, they said, well, we want you a third year, and then it was Dr. Warner at the archives at that point said, well, we're happy to lend you someone, but we can't renew Karen with you because her loyalties are becoming too divided. In other words,
you're becoming too much of a Senate person and not an archives.
It's funny, but I don't really know what he meant by that.
I was about to ask, was that tongue in cheek or was he serious?
I don't know, but I suspect it goes back to the fact that there was somebody projecting opinions from the Senate, which they hadn't had to deal with before. So I think there was some seriousness in it,
And I assume Dick talked to the Secretary of the Senate and was able to get an appropriation for your position.
Yes.
And here we are. So we're up to 1984, and this is really where, when I was doing the preparation for this interview, there's just a huge confluence of events, beginning in 84, 85, 86, where you're developing the archives here at the Senate, but also building a community of congressional archivists.
It's true. It's just amazing. I've kept a chronology, and I'm kind of looking at that now. And
I wish I had that cheat sheet when I was
I'll
doing
give you
that.
a copy.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
But the 80s and 90s, there's so many firsts in this chronology, I want to tell you one little story.
Yes.
So, part of becoming a member of the Senate family, it didn't happen overnight. I would say it took 3, 4, maybe 5 years for people to accept archival advice, really, and from a professional source.
Okay.
And so in working at the Commerce Committee, I was given carte blanche to go through everybody's files, which I did. So and it's commerce, science, and they have a huge jurisdiction over ocean policy. And so it was really interesting to me to see how one committee was covering so many different areas. And so, going into a staff office while they're sitting there working and rifling through their things, they would say, well, who are you and who sent you and what are you doing? And so I'd have to explain all of that. And I would tell them the story that how I got there, that I was going to be reduced in force to the PBS. And so word got around that this is someone who's really great. She's from the Public Broadcasting Service. And I never corrected that.
Nope. Let the people believe what they want to believe.
Somehow the public, a GS3, a public building service, wouldn't have cut the mustard here at all. So part of that time was really, working into, I guess I want to say, the Senate vibe, right?
Right.
Because it has its own seasons, like any institution.
Sure. Well, in 1984, that's also when the House finally caught up to the Senate and established its own historical office in the Speaker's office, which is different from the structure here.
Yeah.
How much work did you do with Ray Smock and the archivist over there? Did they bring in an archivist and historian at the same time?
They did.
Okay.
We certainly would collaborate on things, especially through the round table, with that kind of work. But when it really got to specifics of things like record schedules and finer tuned policy things, the House and Senate are actually quite different. And,
sure.
So there were times that we really had different opinions and had to do things differently because of that difference. And I think the Senate has, I don't want to say always been, and it may be just because it set up its historical office first, but I've always felt that the Senate really has cared about its records more.
Well, it seems subsequent developments in the House Historical Office would lend credence to that perspective.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the round table. That those first conversations are happening in 1984, but the first meeting is not till I think the 86 SAA conference, which was in Chicago, I think. Tell me about how that those first conversations between those dozen or so political and congressional papers archivists came together, and why you decided to band together and create a roundtable within SAA.
Oh, that's really, that network of archivists was really set up in '84, and it really happened after, and I think SAA met here, and we had a session at SAA, and it was after that. But it was really driven. There were some. I mentioned Connie Gallagher and Cheryl and Herb Hartzog, but there were some archivists in the universities who were really interested in working on this, and so we got together, and the NHPRC then funded a conference, which we refer to as the Harper's Ferry Conference.
Right.
And
right.
So I think it was about 20 people of these interested people were invited to the conference, and the proceedings were published, and really kind of gave legitimacy and a basis to certain areas of appraisal and of the records.
So sort of setting I guess, baseline norms that everybody was going to try and follow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think the Dirksen Center was pretty heavily involved in Harper's Ferry as well.
Absolutely.
So that I guess Frank was already
emceeing it. Yes.
Okay.
He did.
So coming out of '85, and also I mentioned earlier a confluence of events. This is also when there's the push to make National Archives independent of the Government Services Administration.
Yes.
So were you and Dick and Don and Ray involved?
Very much, yes, very much so.
Tell me about that, because what would that mean for you and the work that you were doing here trying to document and preserve legislative records?
Yeah. Well, I remember there were lots of closed-door meetings that I was not always invited to, but we certainly were aware that the archives itself was, underfunded, understaffed, and under everything when it was part of GSA.
Right.
And so the historical community under, Anna Nelson was one of the leaders of that, and I'm trying to remember some of the other names too, but there was quite a tight-knit group who were really pushing for that, and I certainly was hoping it would happen too, because if the archives became independent, then the congressional records that were there would get better attention and more support.
And that's what eventually did happen.
Absolutely.
With the Legislative Archives Division, which became what is now known as the Center for Legislative Archives.
Yeah.
And that was, as Ray, I think Ray told us, the way he told it was basically the creation of that division and the creation of that center was almost a thank you present for the help that the House and Senate had provided.
I think it must have been, yeah. I think he's probably right on that.
And what did it mean to bring in somebody like Mike Gillette into
Well, he
to the
was really
center?
Preceded by Mike McReynolds.
Okay, that's right.
He was the first person who, and it wasn't, I'm not sure if it was really a center, it was created as an independent unit. And the salary of that director was improved. There was a historian also at that time. That hasn't been continued, but
I was unaware of that.
Yeah, the staffing was improved considerably, and for this office, I mean, we wanted so much. I mean, there were no real finding aids to the congressional records there. I mean, it was really
so what's the point?
basics.
Yeah.
Basic tools that were lacking, and
Wow.
so that was really the big payout of improving the status of that unit.
So it wasn't just preservation, which was a challenge before, but also providing access, which
absolutely.
is the core function of
Yes.
what we do.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's now, is that something that once that center was up and running, that did that make your life easier in terms of committee records, and you could pivot more to personal papers and working with the Senate, the senators and the Senate staff on their personal records, or is that too simplistic of a take?
Well, it's too optimistic, I guess.
Well, that's me.
But because the staff needed some orienting too at the time, they.
And this is when you wrote the handbook.
I mean, they hired the right staff to do the kind of work to create a finding aid, and it wasn't until 9/11 that our office didn't realize that as we were transferring things to them, and they were accessioning the records and sending back a transfer sheet with an accession number on it, that they weren't putting these numbers on the records, on the boxes. So there were some bumps.
Missed a step there.
Bumps along the way in developing, in that centers being developed.
I laugh. It's not funny. I guess it's probably a laugh or cry situation.
I know. And the way we discovered it is this building was closed for 3 months while it was being irradiated, and so my office got moved to the archives, and I could see what was going on. And it was one day when they were reshelving something, and thinking it was a new accession because the records had come back to the Senate on loan, been returned to the archives, and they were treating it as a new accession because they hadn't marked the boxes with accession.
So they would have
numbers.
no way to know.
So yeah, so I had to get them to have a big project.
I bet they loved you.
I know.
I bet they loved you down.
That's a perfect example of divided loyalties, I guess. I don't know. But, yeah. So that's a funny thing, but not so funny.
Yeah. It's over now.
And it was corrected, so.
Right.
And we've been improving ever since, I have to say.
Let's take a step back and another thing in the mid-'80s. This is when you put together the first handbook on the senator's records and the disposition of the papers.
Yeah.
Obviously, that seems like it was something a long time in the making. But what did it mean to finally have something published under the auspices of the secretary?
Yeah.
Did that give you more cachet is not the right word, but more legitimacy or authority within the Senate?
Yes, I mean, because I worked, the Republican conference was really pushing to have that done. There was a wonderful person who was head of that conference at the time, Patty Jackson, and she and Dick were good buddies, and she really pushed it. And so the way I went about developing that is I put together a committee of 10 different administrative directors and worked with that group to develop those guidelines. And when that handbook was published, I remember being surprised at the reaction of people collecting senators' records in the universities, because people were saying things like, gee, I didn't realize we should keep this, or we don't have to keep that, or I think it won an award from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archivist Group too, because it was the first time that people were getting advice, and I think the way it was developed developed through a democratic process, I guess, within the Senate.
A small d democratic process, as we should point out.
And so that has actually mutated over time. We don't publish that same volume now. That's really devolved into the Senator's Office Archives Toolkit. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the reason we've done that is because the nature of a senator's collection has become really more complicated with the digital component.
Oh, yes.
And so the disposition has become more refined, and we have to change it a lot more frequently. So that toolkit kind of volume allows us to do that.
It's funny we're having this conversation right now, but Robert Lay and I we're having a running conversation with the late Senator Johnny Isaacson's former chief of staff and former head of his IT, and it was, we have the CMS, but we need the password to the CMS, so it was going back through all these records to find the password to open it, and then at the same time you can just drop a hard drive in the mail and say, here's the office server. So it's a mixed bag of blessings and curses sometimes.
It is. Oh, it really is.
Like technology is all the time, I guess.
Yeah.
So this is developing, and is this something that part of your education was of the senators and the staff was convincing them that this actually mattered, and that always seems to be something that Cheryl and I and Robert and I have always run into is you'll ask somebody for their papers or their records or their artifacts, and you're just, the response is, nobody's going to want these things. And then it's this really awkward experience where you have to tell somebody they're very important and what they do is important. Was that just part of the job for you, especially back in the early days?
It certainly was in the early days, absolutely. Yes, I mean, I can remember, you know, conversations with the different members and staff where they seemed surprised and so on. I think it's less so now. Maybe we've gotten better at communicating, and one thing that's helped a lot is the advisory committee on the records of Congress.
It's a perfect transition.
Having the Secretary of the Senate, and the Archivist of the U.S., the Clerk of the House, the House and Senate historians being members, having the leadership appoint members to that has really helped make a difference, because it's you know, it's something that it's a committee that meets twice a year, that produces minutes, that discusses their records. So obviously that means their records are more important, right? If a committee is focusing on what's going on. We're in the process right now of drafting the 7th report to Congress from that committee. And I'm not sure that these reports are read front to back, but the executive summaries we distribute and really make a big issue about what is being recommended in this report, in the body of this report. So that has certainly helped within the community here to raise the level of importance. And
well, and not too long after the advisory committee, which is created late 1990, November 1990, you were probably already at work on the documentation of Congress, that task force, and that was a task force of CPR.
It was, yes.
Tell me about the origins of that, and the report, and what the impact of that was.
Well, documentation studies were really an archival thing at the time. Helen Samuel's publication of Varsity Letters, I think, was, and Helen Samuels was a friend of Dick's as well. So she would stop by, but so that, and me having worked at university archives, that really resonated, that publication, and so I really got the idea that we needed to do something like that for Congress. And so, you know, I just kind of looked around for authors on the different sections, and we pulled that together. And that was really interesting, because the results turned out to be more than I thought at first. I think going into it, it was more for myself education. I really wanted to define what kinds of records were important. And but coming out of it, it really, I think, inspired other university archives to focus more on congressional collecting. And I know, well, there were other things. Faith Phillips published it was like a collection policy statement, and so it kind of inspired other archivists in different places to follow up on some of the recommendations that report made, and to broaden their collecting area, and to define it and define themselves as, and that really did feed into the building a basis for the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress.
As you're talking, I'm putting this in the context of the Russell Library, where I've been, and thinking, 92, 94, there's a huge turnover in members of Congress because of the defeats in 90, 92, 94, with basically the realignment of the South. Republican congressmen coming in, Democrats retiring their records to the Russell Library. This is right around the time Cheryl and others are having conversations about, well, maybe this shouldn't be the Russell Memorial Library anymore. This should be a library for research, a research center. And that really does seem like, yes, it's not until 2003, 2004 when we have the association, but 1994 there's the meeting up in Maine.
Yes, at the Margaret Chase Smith.
At the Margaret Chase Smith, which all these sort of national conferences are always, and correct me if I'm wrong, these seem to be proto meetings.
They were.
Of what would become
yes.
the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. Why did you and others see the need for a new organization, a new association, a confederation of centers, as opposed to working out of CPR, or what is CPS now, of SAA? Why did we, or the community, need something new and different?
I can remember, I don't remember her name, but she was a head librarian or something from the Stennis Center who came here on a visit. And I can remember being in Dick's office. And it was really, I think, she who articulated the need for centers to collaborate and to reinforce each other. And that was the first time I remember someone mentioning that. And when she said that, we were saying, this really is kind of a good idea. And there were more centers being established. So the Glenn John Glenn, and they recently have broadened their name also. So that's still going on. Some of the centers that started as, even Howard Baker, there was a Howard Baker Center that I think is now has a broader name.
Oh, even the Byrd Center. The Byrd Center started as legislative studies and then became congressional history and legislative studies.
So and the roundtable membership tends to be fleeting. In other words, people join when they get a collection and they need to network and so on. So I think that's why a different group of people who were in it, for the long term.
Right.
It made sense. And
so in 2001, there's the Congressional Papers Forum, which it's concerned around these centers. And was there any effort or push to, I guess, develop a definition of what a center was? Or is it one of those things where if you identified yourself as a center, come one, come all?
Well, I know the association has criteria for membership, which I can't pull out of my thin air at the moment, but there is some kind of criteria. And then we were asked, they set up a task force, and Herb and I worked on that, Herb Hartsook and I worked on that, to develop criteria, desirable criteria for a congressional repository. And so we did that. We produced that, and that's actually something that we've incorporated in the Senate in our guidance that we give to senators now, as in terms of what kind of place to look for to donate your collection to. And I can say they found it very helpful. Now, as the years have passed, certain places have emerged, like the Russell Library, as the natural places to think about. And but yes, we did develop criteria, and they're still pretty much in use. They haven't really changed, except to have added more about capacity to handle and preserve digital content.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Which we're having those conversations ourselves about how best and I guess affordability.
Right. Right.
Making those balances work. So tell me about the 2003 meeting over in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. So our friend Ray, he's got this great photograph of all the folks who were there. Some still with us.
It was gone. I can tell you in generalities, it was so exciting. We really felt like we were doing something special, and I remember in our conversations we felt like we were giving more meaning to our mission as congressional archivists. It was just a wonderful meeting, with a great outcome. I mean, our annual meetings, I think, people kind of are able to attend some and not others, but they always say that I've learned more in this 2.5-day meeting than this has been more help to me in my mission than anything else. So.
Well, I mean, it's such a relief sometimes to SAA is so big. And this is obviously Ashton Ellett's opinion. SA is very big. It can be very daunting. CPR can even be big sometimes, but with ACSC meetings, you're with people who know exactly what you're going through. They know what it's like to deal with 500 boxes, 1,000 boxes, terabytes of data, and it is such a resource, especially for younger archivists like me who are new to the field, that to understand that there are people out there who have suffered like you, and it'll be okay, and you'll get through it. And you can always go to those folks.
But what's so special about ACSC is that it's not just archivists.
That's right.
We learn from each other, and I've felt that to sit with historians and really talk about what they find to be important, and what kinds of documentation they use and what they need. And we're constantly learning. I mean, I picked up something at our charm meeting recently. It was, I think, I think it was Carly who said, these legacy memos, and the way she described them and how important that group of records was, it gave me a new idea to push, with the senators who were retiring. Senator Glenn did this, and this has become, a really important manuscript source, and the senators will pick up on that. They need to hear those kinds of stories. And
so the growth of ACSC and the, I guess, the maturation of the Senate Historical Office, did that coincide with more senators making the decision to bring their own archivists on staff, or has that been a relatively recent development among senior members?
It's really kind of remained flat over the years. Okay. We certainly would like to see more offices, but the budgetary situation makes that really, really tough for them to carve out a chunk of salary for an archivist. They do tend to do it after they've announced retirement, and staff move on, and it frees up the budget, and so that's kind of always been the case. We do. We do help them find archivists when they would like to do that, or we've used History Associates a lot, or History Factory. There are a couple of firms where they can bring in someone to work to help close the office, archives. But that's kind of always been the case. It is unusual for a current member who isn't retiring to have an archivist.
Like Senator Britt's,
yes,
her archivist was at our charm
meeting. And Senator Leahy had one for decades. He always, they would retire and he was still going on, and he'd get that.
Maybe Connie Gallagher was in his ear.
Yeah, it had to have been Connie.
Well, I mean, he wrote a very good article a long time ago about the absolute punishment that he and those on staff had when George Aiken's papers were literally just dropped at the door. Yeah. And this was before the networks and support groups that we have now with CPR and ACSC. Poor Connie had to learn on the go. So yesterday Dick told me that when the House concurrent resolution was passed, that you did 2 backflips in his office. He said maybe that was metaphorically, but he couldn't recall. What did it mean for the House and Senate to pass that resolution?
Oh gosh, I have to tell you a little background on that.
Yeah,
because it was really the idea for that. John Bradamus, of course, was one of the originators of the Association of Centers, and he was really, really behind that. But he had a conference in, it was about 2005 in New York City at NYU, and he invited Mike Gillette, myself, Ray must have been there too, but for a panel discussion on well, his hope was to get something like the Presidential Records Act passed to cover Congress's records. But so during the panel, I had put together, actually it was the beginning of this chronology, and to kind of explain where the Senate was going in terms of records preservation. And it was really at that time that the idea of that resolution came through, because we were really thinking, well, we're never going to get a Congressional Records Act, but what could we do? That was the question. What can we do? And so that's how we came up with the idea of drafting that resolution. And so Dick went to the Legislative Council, and that was drafted. And we, worked on that resolution. And then it had to go to the House. And that was my huge disappointment, that it originated in the Senate and it is not S-Congress. The House pushed it. They liked the idea and moved it right through. So, and then it came back over here, and we were, it was going through Governmental Affairs Committee, and Elizabeth Butler was the archivist for that committee, and she was whispering in their ears, "Oh yes, you want to pass, we want to approve this." And so, yeah, we were so excited when that was approved in 2008, I guess it was.
Yeah.
And we use that a lot. I mean, it's front and center in our Closing an Office handbook. And
yes, it would. We like to remind folks.
This is what Congress wants you to do. This is what the Senate wants you to do.
Right. It's not what Ashton or Cheryl or Karen want you to do.
But this is what you should do.
That's right. Yeah. So the next year, you edit and publish the American Political Archives Reader, which is a very substantial resource. And what was the thought process behind why it was time for a publication like that, and what sort of information you tried to convey in it?
Well, we had so many panels at SAA and at the Congressional Roundtable, and there were all of these things floating around that needed to be put down together. Yeah, that was really, it was really the culmination, I think, of everything that had gone before. So that was quite a push and pull too. It took I want to say 2 or 3 years to get that pulled together. Anyway, yeah.
Well, any thoughts of revising and having a second edition?
Well, there really probably should be an update to it, at some point, because even that's dated. I mean, 2009 is.
Right.
It's a different era.
There's the technological change. There's the institutional change that's happened in the Senate, in Congress, since that it would have started in the Bush era, in the Obama era, and things have changed in Washington. Well, and what really changed in that year was the National Archives, the now Center for Legislative Archives, because it was linked with the presidential, it got the same status as the Office of Presidential Libraries. Those two were the first 2 units in the archives to be ingested into the electronic records archive. So I remember, I think it was Mike Gillette calling and saying, well, I have some news from you. We're going to have a congressional records instance of the electronic record archive. And so what that meant was suddenly, we had been transferring some digital content, but that suddenly meant that we needed to get really busy collecting backlogs. Because the digital content was dating from the mid-90s here. Right. And it was time, because before then the archives would take it, but they wouldn't do anything with it. It would sit on the shelf in a box. And so that 2009 was a huge year of change. That was really the year that I really began a push to get the committees to hire archivists, because I knew that, I was a lone ranger until around 2009. So there were a lot of changes that changed to the opening up of allowing us to begin to send digital content wrought. And and so that was the time when I suddenly got to have a deputy in the office, and then a second deputy came a year later, because it was just, we were being overwhelmed with the digital content. And then we went to each committee and made as strong a case as we could that they needed a professional archivist. And so we have about 7 now committee professional archivists on the larger committees. Yeah. Well, you think about it historically. The modern archives is created to manage the huge volumes of paper that a modern nation state could produce. So this is just another evolution of, you can just produce so many records electronically that the archives then have to evolve to manage those on top of all the other records that we're tasked with preserving and providing access to.
But if you think about the archivists, the one committee, Judiciary, has a Democratic and a Republican archivist, but most of them are non-designated, and so that was a huge change to convince committees that they needed to have a person who can go into their computers and appraise what to go to the archives. So and it's been a long haul. We still have, I want to say, one committee that is a holdout on us in terms of acquiring that content. So, but
what's the holdup?
I don't. The concern that of people accessing to the content. Yeah.
Makes sense.
I guess.
I could. How about this? There's a logic there. I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With all of the hacking that starting with the DNC hacking back in 2014, there were lots of ripples about that
I hadn't even thought about that.
we had to deal with, and there's a concern of rogue archivists. I mean, they're all, this is where we are now. I mean, yeah. We archivists have to, I think, be very reassuring, and that we have a task force right now working on access to digital content. What the parameters are going to be with the Senate collections, because the content now is reaching that 20-year period when it can be opened, and we are in discussions right now with the center as to how that's going to happen.
Right. And is there a mechanism for how that will be accessed right now?
We don't have it yet. We're really access to oral histories. I mean, there's we're talking about email accounts, and I want to say the Senate, I think, I have to say I'm very proud of the way the Senate has handled that. We have, I think, done a really pretty decent job of collecting that for the archives.
So we're coming up on all that work. You'll eventually get to see.
And it's reaching the point now that it's reaching the access availability, and so we're working with the archives with Jay Wyatt and his staff to try to really pinpoint how those records will be made available. I mean, people have raised concerns about the ability to alter records digitally and the use of them, for political reasons. I mean, so there's just a lot that we're trying to digest.
And I think that sort of mirrors an earlier generation of oral historians. There was concern, and then perhaps this is shared by archivists as well, is online access and almost universal access to oral histories. Used to be you had to get in your car, train, planes, automobiles, get to the reading room, maybe listen to the tape, usually read the transcript. But now, especially with YouTube and SoundCloud, once these interviews are available, anybody around the world can access them. And I think there was some, there was an amount of nervousness or consternation of, a lot of people are going to be seeing these records that we've created or that we've curated or we've provided access to. So maybe it's only normal that we have these concerns and have an airing of them.
Well, I mean, it is if you watch hearings and the ability of people to go back to what someone tweeted X number of years ago. And
oh, yeah.
it really, this is the world, the way the world works now. People need to be polite, I guess is what I want to say.
Sure.
They need to be polite and try to, if they're, within Congress, a lot of people do go into public service, and so, they want to be sure that their archival records, is not used against them.
Sure.
I mean, and so, there are a lot of real considerations there, I think, practical for people.
Sure,
yeah.
sure. Well, as we wrap up, do you think we'll ever reach that stage where congressional records, Senate records are viewed and valued at the same level as, say, presidential records are?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer it. I mean, certainly within people who use them and study them, I think they will be equal. In terms of the vast public, probably not. But
that does seem to be the conventional wisdom among all of us, but it certainly doesn't detract from the value of the work that's being done, or the importance, rather, I guess I should say. Value is something different to everybody, but I think the importance is pretty undeniable. So, Karen, you're now in your, I guess next year will be your 40th year as Senate Archivist. What are your plans for the future? Apart from taking care of your husband's knees and your travel, of course.
Oh, well, yeah, I certainly hope to travel a lot, and I have been president of the Alexandria Association for not 40 years, but 20-some years, and so I'll probably continue with that for a while.
What's that group do? Is that a historic preservation?
It's the third oldest preservation group in the country, actually.
Oh, wow.
It was founded in 1932, and
wow.
We are a 501c3 group, and we do lectures and tours, study tours, and give grants to historic properties. Yeah.
I was in. This probably isn't the historic property that you're talking about or interested in, but I was in Alexandria not too long ago, and one of the movies that I grew up on as a kid was Remember the Titans, and T.C. Williams High School. So I made a point to go by and see T.C. Williams High School and where integration of that high school produced a winning football team, but also one that everybody knows across the country now because of that movie. Certainly, that's why I know about it. Well, Karen, thank you again for taking time out of your morning on this. Nobody likes to have meetings on a Friday, but I'm glad you took this one.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to record all of this history.
Absolutely.
I just have to say that I never thought I would be here 42 years in February, but there isn't a day that is like any other at the Senate, and I think that's what really has caused me to be here. It's just ever evolving, and
that does seem to be a common thread in all these stories. Is every day is different.
We didn't mention this, but a new thing that the archivists are doing in the historical office are administering grants, and that was started in 21 with the Arizona State University grant. These are Secretary of the Senate grants that are administered by our office, and we now have 6 grants that we're administering.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm going to be out in Tempe next month at Arizona State. Don Critchlow is out there, and obviously Frank McAman retired out there as well.
Oh, that would be him.
So the Barry Goldwater papers were part of my dissertation.
Oh, right,
so,
right. Well, this grant is for the McCain project.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
But that's something this office really hopes to continue. And this year we made a case to the appropriations and got a lot of support from the staff, but this wasn't a good budget year to ask for continuation. But yeah, we're hoping to, because it's unbelievable since the pandemic how a lot of manuscript repositories have really suffered, and they lost staff that haven't been replaced, and funding. And so, you know, these collections are, you know, are really, really need this kind of support to survive. I mean,
they're very.
So we're hoping the Senate continues this. I'm certainly hoping it does. Because the need now is more than ever, it seems.
Absolutely. Well, we will keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. So thank you again, Karen, on behalf of Cheryl and everybody at the Russell Library who send their best. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.